producers in the Languedoc are just facing ruin, bankruptcy, basically. Can't sell their wine. And you're actually hearing more and more winemakers committing suicide because of the current economic climate.
Follow the money.
This is the podcast of the European investigative newsroom Follow the Money. In each edition, we dive into a recent investigation exposing Europe's power brokers, from corrupt politicians and shady lobbyists to mysterious oligarchs and financial fraudsters. I'm your host, Emma Duchesnier, and as always, I'm joined by Follow the Money reporter Alexander Fanza in Vienna. Good morning, Alex.
Good morning.
Today, we're going to uncork a story that goes to the heart of Europe's culture, economy, and identity. The wine industry is being shaken by fraud scandals. Millions of liters of cheap Spanish bulk wine falsely passed off as priced French labels like Médoc and Margaux. Alex, are you the type of guy that's easily fooled when it comes to expensive wines, or can I confidently bring you to a French restaurant?
Well, I'm not a connoisseur at all, but I do have a taste. I live in Austria, so I drink a lot of Grüner Veltliner, like a dry white wine that is very nice on a hot summer's day. I really love that. And yeah, I think I have enough taste to know what I like in a restaurant.
And do you often go to Austria's vineyards as well?
Well, friends of mine do a bit of hobby winemaking in Burgenland, which is the easternmost province of Austria, bordering in Hungary. It's very, very rich, very fertile land where they do a lot of red wine as well. And so my friends are making a kind of natural wine blend, which they buy grapes from a farmer and kind of do their own processing. And it's pretty neat stuff, I must say.
Didn't know that Austria also had its natural wines.
I think you have that kind of scene everywhere. Winemaking is such an interesting enterprise because it ranges from, small scale, basically hobbyists. There's still the odd farmer who does it the old way, but also, and that's I think what we'll talk here later, is just it's also a huge industry. So going from basically SME to the largest of corporations, winemaking is one of the European businesses, I'd say.
Today, we're joined by wine connoisseur and journalist Barnaby Eales, who wrote this story together with Dominique Mesmin. Welcome, Barnaby.
Good morning. Right.
Could you tell us a bit about where your own passion for wine comes from?
Before I started reporting on wine, I was a journalist for newspapers and sectors of the economy business, and I lived in Barcelona for many years, and I lived in France before. So I got picked up. My palate sort of developed there in those places, and then when I moved back to Britain, I was working in London, and then I decided to sort of change track and started learning about wine. I thought I might go into the wine industry, like work in a business or something, but actually I just carried on being a reporter.
And what is the fraud that you actually uncovered in this story?
Fraud first occurred in 2013. Basically, they bought bulk wine, which is from Spain, which is cheaper to produce and lower cost than French wine, and they basically sold it off as Vin de France because there was a crop shortage, and their clients wanted Vin de France, so they had to find a way of getting all this wine to meet demand. So and then it became a scam because of the huge quantities. It's talking like 4.5 million bottles, approximately, over several years. Extraordinary amounts, really.
And the central figure is Jean-Sébastien Laflèche, who's the fraudster
Yes.
in your story.
Yes.
And very interesting about your story is that you actually interviewed him. How come that he was willing to speak to you?
He felt that him and his some of his colleagues were made an example of what they thought was quite severe, sentencing and fines. He lost his house and his car. He had something to say, and he wanted to speak to someone and vent his fury.
So was he working alone? Was it his own fraud, or was he essentially told from higher up to commit this fraud?
I mean, he was a merchant, and he worked with Michel Gillin, who was working for a cooperative. It was his friend. He wanted to find out how to orchestrate this to meet demand. Basically, Laflèche was brought in to falsify documentation. And then there were other players involved, like brokers, making sure the wine came from Spain. and then there was another broker involved. So there was a team. There was a sort of network of people. It was actually it was a tax inspector in the end who sort of spotted something a bit fishy in La Flèche's counting, which led to the sort of unraveling of this extraordinary amount of fraud.
So his fraud wasn't necessarily discovered through the wine, but through his taxes, is what you said.
It wasn't like a client saying, "Oh, your wine doesn't taste as it should do."
It's not it's very hard to detect the fraud in the wine itself.
Yeah.
It's the process and the labeling.
I mean, they have isotopic tests you can do, but then you have to have a rich database of wine from a set to compare that with your test of your sample, which you think might not be from that place. So, and then there's another question of that. If you actually use that sample in court, so whether a court would find that actually admissible as evidence, which is not the case. I know, for example, in Switzerland, it's not admissible legally to use that as evidence.
So what you're saying is wine fraud is very hard to prove, even if you have a reasonable suspicion.
Yeah.
You wrote that wine fraud is said to date back to the Romans. What type of wine fraud did the Romans do?
Well, if you read some Pliny the Elder, he talks about they use herbs and honey or watered down wine, and he's very gets very upset about adulteration of wine or of wine being passed off as good wine or better wine than it actually is.
When I read that, I was reminded of a story from Austria.
Yes.
So in the 80s, there was a massive wine scandal. Farmers, merchants were found to be adding antifreeze substance called glycol. And what glycol does is, so farmers in Austria sometimes add sugar to the wine to make it sweeter, but that is an adulteration that won't be allowed in certain types of wine, certain qualities of wine. So glycol has the advantage of also making wine appear sweeter, but it doesn't count into the sugar. It can't be detected when you're looking for sugar in wine. So that was kind of a trick to take the wine up a notch quality-wise, or at least appearing it to make it more qualitative. And that was a trick that kind of certainly was unethical, certainly was illegal back in the 80s. That really became such a blemish on the reputation of especially Austrian wine. And the industry really has spent the last 40 years changing their ways and cleaning up after that.
But at the same time, I think what we read in this story, it seems like fraud is actually only becoming more widespread. Barnaby, to prevent fraud, these labels, or better called appellations, were invented. Is that correct?
Yes, yeah. If you look at sort of early 20th century, there's all this fraud going on, and wine being brought in from Algeria and mixed, and people were often bringing in wine from other places and diluting it. It's led to France creating the appellation to protect wine production and ensure some levels of quality, and essentially origin, where the wine's from. So this is what the focus was on of the appellation d'origine. So very important in the history of wine. France being obviously a reference country for wine.
Despite this system, what La Flèche actually said in the interview that he did with you is that it was very easy to commit this fraud. How's it possible it's so easy?
Well, yeah, I mean, this is interesting because there's nothing illegal about bringing Spanish wine. It's what happens once it's in the cellar, and then when it's bottled, you see. So when you're bottling it and labeling it, if you're putting different labels on. The Flèche said that French wine's any better than Spanish wine. That's sort of a misconception. So Flèche said, as some vintage Spanish wine they were getting was better than French wine, and obviously if you're using the same grape varieties, none of their clients seem to have noticed or complained about the quality of the wine.
After hearing all these different types of fraud, I can imagine that puts a whole shadow over the sector. How does the sector in general respond to all these frauds?
France says it's stepped up doing inspections in wine cellars, sort of random checks on wine tanks, and for example, there's some new research under the Horizon program looking into using tech combined with chemical analysis to ensure full transparency and trust in the wine supply chain. Basically, they're developing smart tags to guarantee the authenticity and traceability of wine from vineyard to table, so from the origin to the destination.
Because in this moment, how big is the chance that when I open my bottle of wine tonight, that it's actually fraudulent wine, or that the wine is not what it says it is?
Well, I mean, that's a million-dollar question. Yeah, I mean, you have QR codes now on the back of bottles, which gives some information. It's worth looking always on the back label as well. You're probably more likely to see some fraudulent wine in the supermarket wine. You hear about these other stories about collectors going around private jets trying to get hold of 18th century Lafite. But I mean, fraud in wine tends to be in the lower end of terms of quality and price. There's several cases around Europe, and then we have whether there's a causal link, with climate change.
How is climate change affecting the wine industry in Europe?
Well, obviously, there's global warming, temperatures are rising, and it's also very unpredictable weather patterns. So you could have earlier frosts, earlier time of year, and you could have frost at different times of year. So everything's unpredictable. That could, can wipe out your crop. There's been in parts of Southern Europe the last couple of years, drought, incredible drought. I mean, extremely worrying for wine growers, having a serious dramatic impact. When you have rising sugar levels, and that means you can have it can affect the quality of the wine, but also it can have much lower yields. With climate change, alcohol levels or potential alcohol levels have increased, and that's a big problem for wine producers. So one of the ways of doing that illegally, it's totally illegal in Europe, is to water down wine.
How does that happen that wine gets a higher alcohol level because of climate change?
Well, because you have basically sugar levels, sugar levels, they're rising too quickly, before proper maturity of the grapes. So it's not going on a smooth sort of curve, if you like, during the season. So you'll have your sugar levels will be shooting up. So when you actually ferment the wine, it'll be too high. The alcohol could be too high. I was in Bordeaux and I picked up a story talking to a wine producer about how producers that he knew of were watering wine to reduce the alcohol level.
Barnaby, but let's get to the real question here. The subtext of it all is my hangover stronger when the wine was tampered with? Is that the problem with wine fraud? Is that I'll just feel very bad the next day thinking, what happened to me? I just had a bottle or two.
Yeah. Oh, that would depend on a lot of things. I mean, not necessarily if it was that could be something to do with the alcohol levels, definitely.
And for those wine producers that still do produce their wine honestly, the fact that this fraud is so widespread, how does that affect the honest wine producers?
Yeah, well, yes. I mean, you do hear that. That obviously could be unfair competition, because if you're selling millions of bottles of wine, you can sell it cheaper if it's a fraudulent wine made from imported bulk wine. You've labelled it as a local wine, and you can offer it for cheaper prices. So you're undercutting and sort of unfair competition. That affects prices. So it certainly has an impact.
Which in turn, I can imagine, actually might drive more honest wine producers to also commit some sort of fraud just to keep up with the game.
Yeah, we did speak to people in southern France who did not want to buy in bulk wine, but they said no choice, just because of the economic climate in this, producers in the Languedoc who were just facing ruin, bankruptcy, basically can't sell their wine, and they have to find ways of trying to sell their wine and cutting their costs. And you're actually hearing more and more over the last couple of years is what you're hearing more of is suicide. Winemakers committing suicide because of the current economic climate.
It's no longer just an economic issue; it's actually also become much of a social issue.
Absolutely, yes, absolutely, yeah. I mean, and people also the tradition of the vigneron passing down the generations. People deciding that just abandoning that and just do something else in cities or.
But is there also any sort of policy that actually deals with this, with the fact that vineyards in Southern Europe are under pressure, and the fact that maybe people in Southern Europe cannot make a living from wine anymore? Is there any sort of policy response? from the EU or from national authorities in that regard?
There's definitely some funding for climate crisis adaptation measures. There's definitely a proposal from the Commission to increase funding to help in climate change adaptation. You have certain funds for growing up vines and replanting vines, so you could grow up some vines in one place and then replant somewhere else or higher up. So,
and I think then the inevitable question is sort of like, what is the future of Europe's wine industry? Is there a future to Europe's wine industry, or is it sort of a dying tale?
No, I think it's certainly a future. Certainly, I mean, it's just you've seen it's just sort of moving north. Basically, you've got you've got vines in Scandinavia. You've got vines. They got a lot of vineyards in Britain now. Also in France, obviously move further north and more, areas where like Brittany, which is better known for, like Britain, really like making cider or beer. So there's certainly a future.
All right, and I think that's where we'll leave it for today. Thank you so much for joining us, Barnaby. If you want to read the full story about Barnaby and Dominique, check it out on ftm.eu, and there you can find all the details of this story. Thank you, Barnaby, and Alex and I will be back soon for another episode.
You've listened to the podcast of Follow the Money. Our watchdog journalism is funded by our members. Subscribe and support European investigative journalism.